And welcome to another episode of our Sustainability and Resilience virtual gatherings. This session is going to be about growing a kitchen, a medicinal garden. We're really excited to be able to bring these gatherings to you, and even on a rainy day, we're making it happen. So thank you to Dan and Tyler for being there and doing what they needed to do to make this possible. We will have questions throughout, so please enter your questions into the chat. And if you're just arriving, please enter your name, your group, and your email so that we can send follow-up information. We're getting ready to have a place to post all of the resources that we're going to be sharing on the employee resource page, but we'll also be sharing out through email. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Dan, take it away.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Resiliency Series. We're here on a rainy day at the Franklin Permaculture Garden. We're going to be talking about medicinal first aid herbs today. Herbs that you can really turn to if you're feeling sick, if you get bruised, if you have a headache, for a variety of really common ailments. So we're going to talk about what we might be experiencing on a kind of regular basis and what herbs we can turn to in those situations. Here in our garden, we have about 40, maybe even 50 or so medicinal plants growing. And it's really important for us that we include those medicinal plants. First of all, it's important to note that a lot of them are also multifunctional. Some of them are edible at times. Some of them are ornamental. Some of them attract pollinators. So most of them have other functions aside from being medicinal. But that medicine portion is really important. We want to be able to take care of ourselves, our community, without putting additional strain on the medical system. Right now, in this pandemic, we've been talking a lot about the importance of flattening the curve, of reducing the amount of people who are heading to the medical system. And one of the best ways we can do that, aside from a pandemic, is with herbs, with various natural remedies that are all around us. And as humans, we've been doing this for a very long time. We have evidence from 50,000 years ago of people using medicinal plants. We know this because we can actually do teeth analyses, and we looked at the plaque buildup, and we found various medicinal herbs in the plaque of people 50,000, 60,000 years ago. So we have an extremely long history of relationships with these plants. So it's really important for us to get to know these plants and to know the traditions behind them. It can really help to connect us with our land, with our traditions, with our history. But we don't necessarily just have to rely on traditions either. There's actually a lot of research on a lot of these plants. Now, unfortunately, some of the medical research that takes place tends to focus on just one or maybe two of the chemical components of medicinal plants. And that's in part because of the way that that system is monetized. They tend to want to be able to look for those active components so that they can then synthesize them and make medicine. And in fact, about 25% of pharmaceuticals right now are derived from medicinal plants. And a lot of them are synthetic versions of plants. Now, I would actually say that oftentimes the plant medicine itself is much stronger and better suited for our bodies than the synthetic version, because these plants contain oftentimes dozens of active compounds. And in combination, they're quite different from just isolating that one active compound that's often used in the synthetic medical version. So it's really easy to integrate these plants. We're going to be talking about how to grow them, how to harvest them, and how to use them in our bodies and externally as well. So that's a little bit about what I want to talk about. And I want to specifically highlight a couple plants that I think of as being extremely useful as antivirals. Because of course we're all really concerned about COVID-19 right now. We want to make sure that our immune systems are healthy, and if we do get sick, or if we're starting to come down with something, that we have some medicine at our disposal, because as we all know, we don't actually have much in our medical repertoire to deal with viruses like COVID-19 right now. And there is no plant that is going to cure you, but certainly we know of some plants that have strong associations with coronaviruses of different kinds. So I'm going to highlight one or two of those today to give you a sense of what you might turn to if you are getting sick, you are isolating, something that might be able to help quicken your immune response to that illness. I should also mention there are limitations to herbal medicines. If I break a bone in my body, as much as I would like to, I'm going to go to a doctor, because there are limitations for what these plants can do. If you are severely ill, I do really recommend that you go see a professional. And if you're starting to work with herbs on a really potent basis, if you're really taking them very, very actively, you might want to also consult with an expert herbalist, because some of these plants will have negative repercussions if you use them for a very long time, or if you use really, really high doses, or if you're combining them with other medications. I'll mention a few contraindications if we come to them. Most of the plants we're using today are extremely safe. So really, there's no reason to be concerned. But again, if you're using high doses, or if you want to be using them on a very regular basis, I would recommend that you consult an herbalist, particularly if you have preconditions of different kinds. So those are a few of the limitations. And in general, I would just say that herbs are best at the early stages of illness or some kind of, of body issue that you might be experiencing. If you're already really deep into an illness, or if you're already in severe pain, I would go see a medical professional at that time. Really, what we're going to be looking at primarily are preventative or early stage medicines. But again, these medicines have been used for thousands of years. And so I think that, we could really look to that history for a lot of guidance. There are herbal traditions around the world. Some of them are very well known. The Chinese medical system, for example, Ayurvedic medicine in India, those have been in play for 5,000 plus years. There's a lot of texts that we can turn to, a lot of current professionals in that field. And of course, here in North America, we have a variety of indigenous cultures that have used the plants around us for a very, very long time. And a lot of what we know now, we are indebted to those cultures, those traditions, for our knowledge. So I really do recommend, if you're getting interested in herbal medicine, that you turn to some of those traditions for guidance. They have a lot to offer us, as well as turning to more current medical research, which will, I think the two together really create a really strong balance of the tradition and modern medical research to really find plants that have a lot to offer us. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with some of the plants that we're going to be talking about. I'm going to really mostly be looking at them from the perspective of what ailments they might be treating. I'm going to start with a couple that are really useful externally in our first aid kit. So the first one I want to talk about is really useful for bruises, for fractures, for cuts and scrapes. This is a plant called Comfrey. It's a very common plant. It is not native to America. It was brought over here, but at this point, it's fairly well naturalized. I find it pretty frequently in fields. We use it extensively in the garden. This is one of the most multifunctional plants actually that we grow, so we have it everywhere. Aside from being medicinal, this plant is an excellent soil builder. It has a fairly deep root system, and it's able to really take nutrients from deeper in the soil level and bring them to the surface and produce a lot of biomass that we can then chop down to the ground, use as mulch or as compost. So really excellent in that sense. It also is great at attracting bumblebees, so just a lot of uses. But from a medicinal point of view, this is just an incredible plant to get to know. It contains really high levels of a chemical called allantoin. I might pronounce allantoin, not totally sure, but allantoin is a chemical that is really, really useful for cell proliferation. So it essentially speeds up the process of new cell growth. And it also, really importantly, it reduces inflammation, and it's able to do that at a really deep level. So if I sprain a muscle, if I bruise myself, if I even have a minor fracture, this is the plant that I turn to. So see, from an identification point of view, it's not very distinct. It has fairly large leaves. The leaves will actually get significantly larger than this. It's fairly fuzzy. That's one way that you can identify it. It has a little bit of purpling on the bottom of that stem. The part that is most often used, actually the entire plant can be used. Certainly the leaves are very useful, as is the roots. The root actually contains higher levels of allantoin. So if you're looking for something more potent, I would go for the root, but the leaves are excellent as well. Now, when I'm applying this, there's a few different ways that I use it. I often use it as a poultice, which is basically applying fresh or dry herbs directly to your skin. So, for example, if I sprain myself right here, what I can do is essentially macerate this leaf a little bit. Do that right now. You can do that by chopping it up. You can do that by chewing it. You can do it by just kind of macerating it. It's pretty wet leaf. It crumbles up pretty easily. You can then just put it right on your skin, and then I would use a gauze bandage to go around that a few times and secure it in place. And I would leave that there for 1, 2, maybe even 3 days. I would change out the leaves at least once a day so that you have fresh material there. And that's going to penetrate really deeply. It's going to reduce the inflammation, which of course we know that that's why a lot of pain, we experience pain when we do have bruises or sprains, because of the inflammation effect that our body produces. And it's going to produce new skin cells. So it's going to really help to quicken the process of healing. I've actually even used this on animals before. This past summer, I was tending some goats, and one of the goats had a fracture, and we weren't able to bring it to a vet. So we applied Comfrey poultice, just like I did here, for a couple days to him, and the fracture significantly improved, and he was actually able to, to heal fairly well just right on the farm. We didn't have to bring him into a vet at all. So an excellent plant. Aside from using it as a poultice, I also often use it in salves. And a salve is basically, it's also called a balm. It's a mixture that you use externally. It's usually made with beeswax and some kind of a carrier oil. And for that, I often use the root of the plant. And what I do is I just chop it up, either fresh or dry, and I'll infuse it in oil, some kind of a carrier oil, sunflower oil, almond oil, whatever you have on hand. Olive oil is fine. I'll infuse it in that, and then I'll mix it with beeswax, and it becomes this, spreadable but fairly hard material called a balm or salve. And I'll use that wherever I'm feeling any kind of inflammation or pain. Also, I also use it on external cuts and scrapes, because again, it will help your skin heal really quickly. If you have a really deep wounds, take caution though, because this plant actually will cause the external layer of your skin to heal so quickly that the deeper wounds will still be healing. So it actually can often be counterproductive if you have a really deep wound to apply this, because you actually want that wound to heal internally before it closes up externally. So if you have a deep wound really and it's open, I would advise against using this early on. So that's Comfrey. Again, really useful for fractures and for sprains and inflammation. Somewhere specific in the body, not so much just internal inflammation.
Dan?
So, yes, yeah.
If you're gonna use the leaves and the roots, is there a, like a ratio that you would suggest? And how do you harvest the roots?
Great question, yeah. So, there's no specific ratio. For me, it really depends on the season. So this time of year, the leaves are still fairly small. The plant is about this big right now, maybe 6 inches off the ground, 8 inches. And so at this point, I would probably be looking to get the roots. I really harvest the root during the time of year when there's not a lot of aerial growth on the plant. So we're talking really, late fall through early spring is the time that I harvest the root, because that's where most of the plant energy is still in the root system. And to harvest the root, I take a fork, a garden fork or a shovel, and I'll just pop it right out of the ground. It comes out really easily. It takes a little while to wash it off because there's a lot of soil that gets in there. And then I'll just chop it up. You can do the same thing with the aerial portion. Just cut the whole thing right down to the ground and then just chop everything up. Use it either in a salve or infuse an oil with it or make a poultice with it. So I would say late spring through early fall, I would be working primarily with the leaves, flowers, everything that's above ground. And then the rest of the year, when it's more dormant, I would be working with the roots. So that's kind of how I think of it. But again, you can work with really any part of the plant that's available to you at any time. They all contain medicinal compounds, with the root generally being a bit more potent. Great question. Any other questions about comfrey so far? I should also mention, by the way, that it's one of the easiest plants to grow. All you need to grow this plant is a little section of the root. So if you know someone who has this plant, or if you find it somewhere, if you just take the root and you cut it up into 3-inch chunks and you pop it in the ground, you'll have a new plant growing right within a few weeks. So it's incredibly easy to propagate, and that's in part why we have so much of it here. It's incredibly useful and so easy to create more plants. So we kind of pop them in anywhere where we're creating more garden space. They're just incredibly multifunctional plants.
Dan, is there any reason you would eat it?
That's a great question. So I actually have eaten comfrey before, but if you come over to our garden and you look at our comfrey sign, it actually says caution, poisonous. So comfrey contains a certain acid, and I'm forgetting the name of it right now, that in very large doses can be toxic. It's more of an anti-nutrient than a toxin, really. So it can bind to certain other nutrients and flush them out of your system. So if you're eating it regularly, we're talking, on a weekly basis or even on a daily basis, yeah, it's not good for you. But honestly, there's a lot of fear out there in terms of eating comfrey. I generally don't recommend it, but if you do ingest it occasionally, it is not dangerous. There's a lot of research now showing that if you do occasionally ingest it, you'll be perfectly fine. And actually, there are traditions out there of people taking it internally to reduce internal inflammation. So I would say use it internally with caution, but not on a regular basis.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, great question. So let's talk about one other plant, which unfortunately I don't have with me right now because they're just starting to germinate. Another plant that could be really useful in your first aid kit for external conditions is calendula. Some of you might be familiar with calendula. It's also called pot marigold sometimes. Calendula officinalis is the Latin name. Really, really useful plant. I mean, honestly, if you have a garden, I highly recommend growing some calendula. It's extremely easy to grow, like comfrey. Calendula is an annual plant, unlike comfrey, which is a perennial, meaning that you have to, it'll start its life cycle every spring and then it'll die in the fall. Oftentimes, though, they do self-seed, so sometimes you don't actually have to even replant it. But they're very, very easy to start from seed. If you get some seed, you can just sprinkle them right outside, right now. Just gently work them into the soil, and they're very, very quick to grow. So calendula, I think of as really useful for open cuts, for burns, for very kind of surface level conditions. It's very cooling, and like comfrey, it helps your skin regrow very quickly. So calendula is extremely useful for those things, and usually it's the flower head that's harvested and used as medicine. The flowers are beautiful. They do come in a lot of colors, but The most potent variety is called Calendula Rosina. Rosina coming from the word resin. It's kind of sticky. If you work with the plant, it's really, that's how you know it's really potent. That sticky quality that actually tells you that there's a lot of medicine in that plant. The Brezina Calendula are orange when they bloom, and you can just pop the whole flower head right off. They're about the size of a $50 coin. You can either use them fresh or dry. They dry really easily. Just put them out at room temperature under the sun or in the shade, doesn't matter. They'll dry very quick. So I tend to use calendula as an infusion in oil or as a cream or salve. So something, again, that I'm going to be applying externally right on the skin surface. I should also mention that calendula has antiseptic and antibacterial qualities. So if you apply it to an open cut or a scrape, not only will it help your skin regrow, it'll also take care of any bacteria that may be lingering in that cut. So really great if you have kids around that are constantly cutting themselves. I've got a 4-year-old at home who's pretty prone to injury, so I often have some calendula salve around, and I'm applying it pretty regularly to him. So great plant to get to know. Now is a great time of year to be planting seed. And in fact, actually, we have a ton of extra calendula seed. So if anyone is looking for some and is having trouble finding any, please write into us, let us know, and we can find a way to get you some seed for calendula so you can start growing some yourself. It's a great plant to have in your garden. I should also mention, internally, some people do use calendula for cleansing their lymphatic system. So our lymphs are really associated with taking toxins out of our body. Our lymphs tend to swell up when we're sick. If you are having issues with your lymphatic system, if you want to tonify them, to detoxify a little bit, taking calendula internally as a tea, just brewing the flowers in hot water for 5-10 minutes, will do an excellent job of tonifying that system. So I really do recommend it for that as well.
Questions, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
So one question is related to the comfrey. Can you make a tea out of the comfrey?
Yeah, I've never used it as a tea. I would say, I generally, again, I don't use it internally very much. I really do mostly use it externally. I would say the only reason I could think of that I would want to use it as a tea would be if I wanted to, for example, soak my feet. Let's say my feet were really swollen for some reason. I would definitely consider making an infusion or a decoction with the root or the leaves, and then soaking my feet in that. Or perhaps, maybe as a wash, but again, you really want to apply it and keep it on wherever you're feeling inflammation or wherever you want to reduce swelling and promote skin growth. So I would say it has limited uses as a tea, but definitely, the medicinal compounds are active as a water infusion. So yeah, it can work, but generally not used in that way.
Great. And then for the calendula, is that
I'm sorry, you cut out a little bit there. For the calendula?
Is calendula marigolds?
Yes, it is related to marigolds, but it's a separate species altogether. So yeah, don't confuse it with marigold. And marigold has a completely different set of medicinal qualities. So really, you're looking for Calendula officinalis is the full name. And again, one of the common names is pot marigolds, but don't confuse them. You really want to go for the Calendula officinalis.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So I want to talk about
one more. Does calendula need special soil to grow in?
Great question. Yeah. So, and actually, I should mention that for the other plants that we talked about too. Calendula is extremely adaptable. You don't need anything special. You just need to give it partial light. So even a half day of light is sufficient. Here we grow it actually in part shade and seems to be doing just fine. And we don't give it any compost. We don't give it any fertilizer. nothing at all. Same thing for comfrey. Extremely versatile, doesn't require any special conditions. We don't add anything to the soil when we plant it. We just pop it in the ground. And in fact, that's true for a lot of medicinal plants in general, that they don't need any kind of really special soil. Almost none of them need any kind of fertilizer to do really well. So we don't really baby them much at all. But that's a great point. And I'm going to try to do my best to talk a little bit more about the cultivation of these plants too. So yeah, definitely keep asking questions if anything comes up. These are fantastic questions so far, and I really appreciate them. So I want to talk a little bit about cold and flu symptoms and what we can do if we're starting to feel the onset of some of those symptoms coming on. That's obviously something that a lot of us are thinking about right now, or this possibility of getting sick. So I'll talk about a few plants that are the ones that I tune to first in my arsenal. The first one I want to talk about is Echinacea. Unfortunately, I don't have Echinacea to show you right now because it's just coming out of the ground. So it's a little bit small. It's not blooming yet. A lot of you are probably very familiar with Echinacea, so I'll kind of just skim through some of the medicinal qualities. I'll talk about growing it. Echinacea is extremely useful at the early onset of cold and flu symptoms. It's really good at kind of getting your immune system into gear. And I generally take it if somebody else in my family is getting sick. I'm already starting to take Echinacea because, again, I want to prevent myself from getting sick. Echinacea is really good at that prevention quality. And the form that I generally take Echinacea is a tincture form. And I'm going to show you guys what that looks like. I should actually, before I talk about tinctures, let me just say that it's the entire plant that has medicinal qualities. Most often, it's the root that's used. And if you are going to work with the root, you want to harvest it when the plant is dormant. That is late fall through early spring. So that's the best part to work with. But the aerial portion is also really medicinal. The leaves, the flower heads, and the seeds can all be used. If I am using the aerial portion, though, I tend to use more volume to get the same medicinal effect as I would if I'm using the roots. I should also mention that from a garden point of view, Echinacea is incredibly beautiful. I would grow it even if it wasn't medicinal because it's just such an incredible plant. I mean, it produces flowers for months on end. They come in every color you can imagine. Purple probably being the most common, but there's white varieties, there's red varieties, you name it. So it's just a great addition to the garden. It's a perennial plant as well, so it comes back year after year. You don't have to replant it. So really easy to grow. And I want to talk about how I use it. I tend to use it as a tincture. Now, for some of you may be familiar with tinctures. It's a really common way of ingesting herbs. Basically, what it is a hard alcohol that's been infused with herbs for a while. Now, a while being usually 1 to 2 months, but it could even sit longer than that. So if I'm making an Echinacea tincture at home, what I usually do is I'll take whatever part I'm working with, the root or the seed heads, or the flowers, leaves, whatever I have, or a combination of all of them. I'll chop them up fairly finely after I wash them, and then I'll put them into a jar and cover them with hard alcohol. Usually I'm looking for something that's at least 40% alcohol and up to even 90% alcohol, but something that you'd want to ingest, right? So it has to be something that is you can take internally. I often work with something as common as vodka or whiskey, whatever you have on hand. Doesn't matter as long as it's strong, because it's the alcohol that does a lot of that tends to be more solvents of the medicinal qualities of the water. And basically, I'll leave it in there for a month or two. I'm going to shake it every once in a while whenever I think of it. And after a couple months or less, I'm going to strain all the plant material out through a cheesecloth or something else that can catch it, squeeze it all out, and then that liquid that's left over, that's your tincture. It's very strong and very shelf stable. So it's a great medicine to take. It's much stronger than a tea form would be of these plants. And most of the plants we're talking about can be tinctured. So tinctures, I usually take them 2, 3, 4 times a day during those times that I'm starting to either feel the onset of symptoms or even before if I know I'm being exposed to pathogens from my family or from others around me, coworkers, etc. So that's usually the form I take it in. You can definitely buy Echinacea tincture. It can be a little pricey, so if you are able to grow it yourself, you can make a whole year or more supply without too much fuss, and that's going to be a real asset to both yourself and your family and your community. So there's usually plenty to share. Any
Dan?
questions? Yeah.
Yeah, if you know somebody who has echinacea plants, can you just grab some of theirs, and when would be a good time to do that?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, there's a couple ways that you can get some echinacea plants for yourself. So for one thing, they're pretty easy to start from seed. If you start them right now, you should have them ready to go in about a month, and you pop them in. So that's one way. The other way is that, yes, you can easily move them if you know someone who's growing echinacea. Because they're perennial plants, they do, first of all, self-seed in the garden, so oftentimes you'll see seedlings here and there. And sometimes you can even just take an older plant, you can take the whole thing out and just divide the root system in half, and then take half of it and put it somewhere else. Now is the best time of year, actually, to be moving those plants around. So if you're able to identify it in the garden, you can just pop it out with a shovel or with a trowel and move it to a new location, and you'll have it there for years to come. Their lifespan is about 5 years. At that point, they tend to kind of start to decline. But again, they do self-seed, so you usually end up with plenty of plants even after 5 years. Now, in terms of growing conditions, they're native to the prairie of America, so they are fairly well suited to our climate. They don't need any kind of special soil. In fact, they love poor sandy soils even, but they do really like full light. So if you give them that, they'll be very happy. They'll be stronger medicinally as well if you give them that light. So other than that, I wouldn't fuss over them too much. They don't really need any kind of help. They don't have any pest issues that I am aware of. Very, very resilient plants. So put some in your garden this spring if you can. If you can't find any seeds, or if you don't know anyone who has plants, get over to a local nursery. There's some that are still open, doing curbside pickup in the area. Buy a few plants and pop them in, and you will not regret it. It's fantastic medicine.
Great. Do you need more than, if you were going to get some from someone else, do you need more than one root, or is one root enough?
So I would say if you're going to be harvesting it on a regular basis, I would go with at least 3 plants. That way you can let some of them grow out and harvest the root system of one. If you do harvest the root system, it is possible to get the plant growing again from a small portion of that root, but it's a little bit more challenging. So I like to have several plants just in case, that one doesn't work out. And again, they're such fantastic plants for so many reasons that I would want to have them in the garden regardless. But certainly if you're going to be harvesting the root system, I would definitely recommend having more than one plant. They don't take up that much space. So you don't need more than a couple square feet to be growing 2 or 3 plants. Any other echinacea questions? They're great questions, folks. Okay, great. So let's talk about another plant that I think of as excellent cold and flu plant, that being yarrow. I'm going to hold up the leaves here. Very, very common plant. It's native to several continents, including North America, and has a history of use everywhere it grows. So Native Americans here made a lot of use of yarrow, and in Europe, there's a long history of yarrow. Kind of interesting story behind these plants. The Latin name is Aquileia millefolium. Aquileia comes from Achilles, the Greek god hero from the Iliad. And the reason it's named after him is that the story in Greek mythology is that Achilles was held up and dipped in a tea of yarrow when he was born, and they held him by his heel. They dipped his entire body to protect him. This is a protective plant, helps us heal from injuries. They dipped his entire body, and of course, they were holding onto the heel, so the heel was the part that was left undipped. Of course, we know Achilles' heel was ultimately his downfall because it wasn't protected by this wonderful plant yarrow. So a lot of really interesting stories behind this plant, but everywhere you see it turning up around the world, it's used both externally and internally. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the internal uses, but just a quick note, externally, it's used, as that story suggests, for healing wounds. If you have a bloody wound, an open gash, take some yarrow and, again, just kind of rub it up to get some of those medicinal compounds out, and just put it right on the bleeding area. And you could either hold it down there or you could gauze it up. And it's incredibly good at stopping bleeding. It also happens to be antibacterial, so it will also help clean that wound out. So this was the premier plant that was used by soldiers in the ancient world, and really even up until fairly modern times. All soldiers knew where to get some yarrow and how to use it, because if they had a really bad bloody injury, this was their first line of defense. Now, internally, yarrow is really, really good at breaking fevers. So if you're already deep into a flu, or if you have a fever for whatever reason, I turn to yarrow. I make a tea out of it generally, although you can take it as a tincture form as well, just like we talked about with Echinacea. And I make a really potent tea. I'll let it brew for 10 minutes or so. And I'll take it internally. Basically what it does is it induces sweating, and it helps break the fever, quote unquote. So actually for a little while, you might start to feel a little bit higher of a fever, but ultimately within 24 hours, usually that fever will start to break. And again, you have to really be taking it regularly. So take yarrow, you'll start to feel that kind of sweating quality, and that's how you know it's really starting to have an effect. So that's really what I turn to it as. It has a lot of other uses. It's fairly strongly flavored. It's not the best tasting tea, but it really, really works to help break those fevers up. So I really do recommend it if you're already deep into a cold or flu. Pardon me. So I would work with it in that way. Yarrow is another plant that's extremely easy to grow. It's a perennial plant. Comes back year after year. We have some here in our garden that's been growing 10 years. We've barely touched it, and it's just been fantastic. We harvest the flowers as well as the leaves, although the flowers tend to be a little bit stronger. Here you can see an example of flowers. These are dried from last year. They flower for a good portion of the summer. Really beautiful, great for pollinators as well. So the flowers will be a little bit stronger, but certainly the foliage works fine. So if you put it in there somewhere, just know that it's pretty persistent. So put it in a spot where kind of out of the way is where I think of it. It likes to grow in the worst possible soils, doesn't need any help, does like a lot of light. So, give it at least a half day light, preferably more. They'll be quite happy.
Is that a yellow plant?
So the foliage is green, the flowers are white. When they're dry, they do kind of get yellowish, though. Right. But they generally have white flowers. Now, there are actually some cultivars, meaning varieties that are bred for specific colors or textures, and some of those are yellow. But if you're working with the medicinal qualities, I recommend going with the white flowered one that's not a cultivar. Usually when you start to breed something to make it prettier, you actually lose some of the medicinal qualities of those plants. So go with the wilder version, kind of the more primitive version of the plant, if you will. This is also a plant that if you get to know, you will start to find it everywhere. In fields, along roads, it's just about everywhere you turn. So if you don't want to devote space to it in your garden, if you don't have a lot of space, just know how to identify it and you'll start to see it everywhere. Great question. Any other yarrow questions or other questions so far? Great. So let's talk about, I want two other plants that are, I think of as kind of cold and flu plants. This one is one that some folks may not be familiar with. This is called Meadowsweet. And it's a plant that we have quite a bit of in our garden here. I actually didn't know that much about this plant until a couple of years ago when I learned that aspirin was essentially derived from meadowsweet for a long time. Meadowsweet contains a lot of salicylic acid, which goes by another name, aspirin. So basically, I would use this plant in the same way that I use aspirin. So for mild headaches, it's useful. But the reason I associate it with cold and flu as well is that it tends to alleviate some of the achiness of colds and flu. So if you're feeling a lot of just kind of body swelling, muscle achiness, that's often what I get when I'm sick. I like to make a tea out of this or even a tincture, and it reduces internal inflammation, just like aspirin does. So you can use them really quite similarly. Now, of course, meadowsweet has a lot of other active compounds aside from salicylic acid, and they all work together. So I tend to go with meadowsweet over aspirin, but really they both work extremely well. Aspirin, of course, has a lot of other uses aside from inflammation, inflammatory. People use it for heart conditions sometimes. So I don't necessarily associate meadowsweet with those because I don't like to use any herb on an extremely regular basis that's going to be fairly potent. I don't work with meadowsweet very often unless I'm sick. So I would be cautious about working with it very regularly. But it's an extremely easy one to grow, and all I do when I harvest it, I just wait for it to flower. I'll cut the entire flowering stem down with the leaves and all. So basically, I'm cutting the plant roughly halfway, leaving some of it to regrow. And I'm going to either dry or use it fresh at that point. If I'm using it fresh, usually I'll make a tea. If I'm drying it, I'll either make it a tincture or I'll make a tea out of it later on in the season. So really, really easy one to grow. It's a perennial plant. It tends to be a weed where it comes from in Europe and in the UK. Here you won't really find it in the wild so much. So if you want to work with this plant, you do need it in your garden. So I would recommend just kind of giving it a spot, again, that's fairly sunny, but otherwise nothing special. Loves poor soils, it likes heavy soils. We have it growing in what's almost a swamp, and it's doing just fine. It's a really easy one to propagate. You could just dig up a portion of the root and move it somewhere else, and it'll start regrowing just fine. So if you have someone in your area who's growing some, you could just divide it right now and easily have a new plant ready to go for the season.
And I've got a question.
Yeah.
Someone wants to know if you can make a face serum with it.
Oh, interesting. I've never tried or heard of anyone doing that. But again, it does have those anti-inflammatory properties. I've only heard of it being used internally. I would love to do some more research on that. So I'm not sure, but definitely worth looking into. Yeah, great question. Any other questions about meadowsweet? It's also just a wonderful plant, again, that the name implies the fragrance, and it really is extremely fragrant when it's in bloom in the summertime. So it's a great companion to have, just an all-around fantastic plant. I'm going to talk about one more cold and flu-related plant, which some of you may be familiar with. It's been flying off the shelves really since this pandemic got started, and that's elder, Sambucus canadensis. Elder, you can actually see some right behind us here. If you, I don't know if you can all see that, but this shrub, I'm going to just point it out real quick. Here we can go. So this plant right here, this is our elderberry. We have several shrubs, and in fact, if you zoom down here for a second, Howard, you can see that we're actually, it tends to sucker, so it's kind of growing all over the place. It's extremely easy to grow. So if you're looking for some, stop by the garden, and we can even give you a cutting to start your plant. So why don't we talk a little bit about how we use elder. So elder, most people think of it as a plant that is used for cold and flu, and most people think about the berries. But in fact, what's interesting is that the entire plant is medicinal. The berries, of course, are medicinal, but as are the leaves and the bark. So if you don't have access to elderberries but have a plant nearby, you can harvest the leaves and the bark, and they are in fact as strong, and some people even say, I've kind of seen contradictory evidence, but some say that they're even stronger than the berries. Now, the primary use for elder is to essentially strengthen our immune response to cold or flu. It's really, really good because it actually increases your T cell content. So if you're starting to feel sick, reach for some elder. Not only does it shorten the duration of whatever illness you may have, primarily viral illnesses, it doesn't work with bacteria, but it also reduces the symptoms. Elder is one of the best studied plants, again, using modern medical research. There's just a tremendous amount of research showing that not only does it reduce the severity of symptoms, but it actually reduces the time span that you were sick as well. So for that reason, it's just an incredible ally to get to know. The berries tend to ripen in August or late July. They're really easy to find. It's a native plant. There's also a European counterpart, Sambucus nigra, black elderberry. But here in our part of the country, we have a lot of wild elder growing all over the place. So if you don't have any in your garden, you could probably just go for a walk and you might well find some. It's a plant that really loves wet conditions. So if you're looking for it in a wild or uncultivated area, you want to look for it on the edge of a stream or a pond or ravine. It tends to kind of grow in really moist conditions and usually prefers full light. So look for it in an area that's getting up and as well. It's fairly easy to identify throughout the season. It has a pretty unique structure, unique flowers, unique berries. And if you're looking to grow it in your garden, it's extremely easy to grow. All you need to do is take a cutting of the plant, really any time of the year, and just stick it right in the ground. It's kind of like willow in that wherever you put it in the ground, it will root, start growing. So for that reason, we love it. We move it around the garden. We give a bunch away. So if you want some to start in your garden, talk to us. We'll get you a cutting, just stick it right in the ground, and they'll be ready to go.
Dan,
The shrub, yeah.
How much space, it looks kind of like can get kind of big. How much space do you need to account for even when you stick a little stick in the ground?
Great question. Yeah, it's a large plant. I would define it as kind of a large shrub. It doesn't get to a tree size, but our plants here they're probably in their 8th year. They've gotten about 10 feet tall or so now. And that's about the tallest I've ever seen them. So they won't get any taller than that. You can keep them trimmed down a little bit. So if you want them to be a little bit lower, you can certainly just cut them back and they'll be fine. In fact, we even cut ours right down to the ground sometimes and let it regrow from there. And it does a fantastic job of regrowing very, very vigorously. It's a really fast growing plant.
Is there a certain time of year that you should cut it back?
Yeah, if you are going to cut it back, I would recommend doing that when it's dormant. So before it's leafed out. Usually the winter time is the best time to be doing that. Great question. Yeah. So let's talk about how to actually ingest elder. The most common form is elderberry syrup, which is basically the berries boiled down with a little bit of water added, and usually there's some sweetener added to it as well, mostly to make it more palatable. I love to use raw honey because, again, raw honey has its own suite of medicinal qualities. But you can also use sugar, whatever else you have available. Some people also add other medicinal herbs or spices. Ginger or clove or cinnamon are common because those tend to also have qualities that are good for cold and flu symptoms. So whatever you might be using, you do want to cook whatever part of the plant you're working with. The berries need to be boiled. If you eat too many raw berries, it could actually have a mildly toxic effect on your body. So we always want to process them. If you're using the leaves or the bark or the flowers, you generally want to make those into a strong tea or decoction. Now, when I say decoction, basically what I mean is boiling that part of the plant for 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes more. An infusion, on the other hand, is more of what we think of as a regular tea, where you take it, a plant part, and just put it in hot water. You don't boil it, you just let it sit in that water for 5 minutes or so. So when I'm using the bark, I actually actively boil it for a while. When I'm using the berries, the flowers, or the leaves, I'll make an infusion. They don't really need that active boiling so much. And I'll take it 2, 3, 4 times a day sometimes when I'm starting to feel cold or flu symptoms. Again, viral only, does not work with bacterial issues. So you really need to know what your experience, what you have. If you suspect it might be a bacterial issue, I would look for other medicine, because this is not going to be much help for you. And of course, this is one of the premier medicines that we know of for various coronaviruses. It's too early to say what particular effect it has on COVID-19 specifically, but we know from previous testing that it does have a really strong impact on other strains of coronavirus. So the suspicion is that it's going to be equally effective for COVID-19. But again, if you're experiencing severe symptoms, you need to seek medical advice from a professional. Don't rely purely on elder or any other plant. But for those early onset symptoms, elder is fantastic. Other questions about elder? Okay, great. So I want to talk about maybe a couple more plants. We're going to move away from cold and flu for a second and talk about another symptom that I think a lot of us are experiencing these days, which is anxiety and sleeplessness. I don't know about you guys, but I've actually been having a lot of trouble sleeping over the last month. And I'm not sure exactly what's causing it. I mean, it could be the fact that, the world is changing on a daily basis, and, everything is just shifting so fast. So I have talked to a lot of people who've been saying that they've been having trouble sleeping as well. And one of the plants that I turn to when I'm having trouble with sleep or just feeling a lot of anxiety is this plant that I'm holding right here. This is valerian. It's a very common plant to work with. Almost all places that offer herbal medicine will be offering valerian as well. It is primarily the root of this plant that has the medicinal qualities. And this plant is just one of the best, if not the best plant that I know of for reducing anxiety, for generally kind of calming down your central nervous system, and for promoting sleep. And really importantly, it doesn't make you drowsy, and yet somehow helps us fall asleep. I really like to take this herb as a tincture because I like to take a really strong form of it. So I will harvest the root, generally speaking, in the late fall or early spring. So whenever I can dig into the ground while the plant is dormant is when I'm harvesting the root. The root has a lot of fine hairs. It's not a big root. It's kind of very fine, almost like angel hair pasta, if you will. And so I'm going to give it a really good wash. Then chop the whole thing up, put it in alcohol, leave it for a month or two, and you have a really nice tincture to work with. It's kind of a very, very fragrant plant. Can't say I love the smell of it, but it's just such a fantastic anti-anxiety plant. So I really think of it primarily as a nerve on, something that's going to calm the central nervous system. And it's really easy to grow. We have some here in the garden that's growing in some of our worst soils. Soils that are really poorly draining, that are a little bit shaded, that are just really rocky. And we put a couple plants in the ground that we started from seed, and it's just taken off. They're self-seeding all over the place. In fact, it's getting to the point where it's almost a weed, which is okay with us because we can dig them up and harvest the roots for fine. They do produce a really nice white flower for about a month or so, maybe even a little less in the summertime. But we don't really harvest the flowers. We leave those to the pollinators. We wait for the dormant season to get at the root. And that root will store for a while, so you can dry it if you want, or you can tincture it. I do occasionally make tea out of it, but that's really my less preferred way. I usually want tincture. because when I'm feeling anxiety, I want something to be effective right away. Tincture's really going to do the job really quickly, very effective. So that's valerian. It's fairly easy to start from seed. If you're looking for some seed, let us know. I think we have some extra. And if you're looking for some plants, it should be fairly easy once you get out of nursery. Any questions about valerian?
And it's a perennial, correct?
It is a perennial, yeah. And the best time to harvest it is either in its second or third year. Eventually, it's a fairly short-lived perennial. We haven't reached our lifespan yet here, but I've heard that they usually die back in about 5 years. But ours are going into some are going into second year, some are going into their third year, and they seem to be doing really, really well, really holding their own. So great one to include. And we might even have some seedlings to offer if anyone's interested. So write to us if you're looking for a variant. Let's see. I want to talk about maybe just one more, maybe even a couple more plants really quickly. Okay, all right. You know what? So I'm going to pause right there. There's a couple more plants that we could have talked about, but the list is very long, and I hope you get the picture that there's just so many useful allies that we can easily incorporate into our landscape or even find in a wild setting. And this is just such a fantastic first line of defense. It's going to make you more self-sufficient, and ultimately it's going to mean that our medical system has more capacity for really severe issues. So this is a fantastic way that we can really start to take control of our own health. So I really recommend that folks learn more about herbal medicines. There's a lot of great resources online. I want to just mention one or two resources really quick. If you're interested in plants that might be useful specifically for antiviral, for COVID-19 or other coronaviruses or other colds, right? I mean, all colds are coronaviruses as well. I would really recommend a book called Herbal Antivirals by Stephen Herod Buhner. Buhner is B-U-H-N-E-R. He's one of the premier herbalists in America. It's a fantastic book. And in fact, he recently even published a specific paper about COVID-19 herbs. And I can send that around after the class is over. It's a really, really good resource. So that's one resource. I also really recommend Rosemary Gladstar, another herbalist who lives up in Vermont. She has a variety of books out which go into herbal preparations. So if you want to know more about how to make tinctures, decoctions, salves, Rosemary Gladstar is a fantastic resource. And of course, there's 1,000,001 YouTube links and the rest. But I would really be cautious about the sources you use. There's a lot of poor information out there on the internet. When it comes to health and medicine, you really want to know you are looking at a very reputable source. So please, please, please be cautious about what you find online. So with that, I don't know if there's any last questions, but I'm happy to answer anything. I'm also happy to talk offline if anyone wants to continue the conversation.
It doesn't look like there are any other questions coming in, but as Dan said, if you have any questions that come up after the session, please feel free to send them along. And thank you so much for joining us.